Following the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, the United States and the Spanish kind of had a very intense period of diplomatic exchanges. Spain denied responsibility for the destruction of the ship, which of course we know historically Spain was almost certainly not involved in it. But eventually the United States, for a number of reasons, some reasons being social and cultural reasons, a desire to go to war against Spain, which had really been a sentiment that had been building since the Cuban Revolution began in 1895, that really drove politicians to take action in this case. And the United States would establish a naval blockade of the island of Cuba and eventually engage in military assaults in Cuba and also Puerto Rico. On this map, you see the little box down here. The box is highlighted here, and it shows you the landing of U.S. troops, and it shows you where Theodore Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, that volunteer regiment, raided San Juan Hill in their charge of San Juan Hill. Ultimately, the Spanish Navy is destroyed, and this is a very short war. The Spanish-American War, as it relates to Cuba and Puerto Rico, doesn't even last a year. In fact, there were more American sailors and soldiers that died as a result of disease and sickness from eating rancid meat than they did from actual combat. And it should also be said the United States was itself pretty poorly planned or pretty poorly prepared for this war. And in a lot of respects, only won because the Spanish were that much less prepared. Spain was a kind of an old empire that had really seen its most powerful days long ago. And so Spain had a lot of economic issues as a nation, and it was in no way, shape, or form prepared for a contest with the United States, which was now sort of emerging as one of the world powers of the 20th century. Of course, interestingly, if you look at this map, you see that the expedition led by General William Shafter started actually in Tampa. And for those of you who know the greater Tampa Bay, St. Petersburg area, the greater Tampa Bay area, I should say, know that Egmont Key is a place where there's a lot of history there. And there's an old fort on Egmont Key. It's an island located sort of at the mouth of Tampa Bay, right up in here. And interestingly, that fort on Egmont Key was built, though the island was used for other purposes. It was actually used for the imprisonment of Seminole Native Americans in the early 1800s when the Seminole Native Americans were being effectively pushed out of Florida. But during the Spanish-American War, Egmont Key became a location for a base in case the Spanish were to try to attack the U.S. from that direction, as it was really the most significant and closely located embarkment point for the U.S. Navy and military at that time. The Spanish-American War was a case of real opportunism for the United States, where here you had a situation where the motivation for the United States was first started in 1895 with the sort of Cuban Revolution and the role of yellow journalism and sort of building up the sentiments of Americans. And then the USS Maine explodes in February of 1898. And of course, yellow journalists then use this even further to motivate the popular will for war at this time. When the Spanish-American War happens, however, the United States was really poised to become a world power. And it took a lot of actions that were more or less unrelated to events in Spanish-held Cuba. These were things like the annexation of Hawaii, which the United States did in 1898. Hawaii was not a Spanish possession. It just happened to be an area that, and I will mention some of the motivations in a moment, an area that the United States had really had its eye on for some time for a number of reasons. The United States will also attack the Spanish colony of the Philippines. It will seize it as a colony and control it as a colony until July 4th, 1946. Though even after that, it maintained a military presence on the Philippines for decades following. Some of the motivations for the United States to sort of use the Spanish-American War in its pursuit of greater world influence, to become a world power, included things like the desire for trade with China, Asia markets. So Secretary of State John Hay was famous for issuing his open door notes. There were two of them. And these open door notes were basically, they were sent to the colonial powers like the British and the French, asking them to not colonize China. And there was a great deal of imperialism in China. So the British military, the French military power, these entities had really, the Japanese, had really come to sort of force the doors of China open to the exploitation of the imperial world. But China hadn't been formally colonized, meaning they hadn't been, if you will, conquered and had territories annexed and seized for colonial countries. The United States really didn't want that to happen, because the United States wanted a piece of that market. If China were to become a colony, or 3 or 4, of France, Japan, Germany, and Great Britain, the United States wouldn't be able to trade openly with them or freely with them. So the United States had sought open trade with China, largely because it was a burgeoning powerhouse with a lot of manufactured goods, and it needed markets for that stuff. That was a major motivation, because the Philippines is geographically located very close to China in places like Hong Kong, which was really the center location whereby a lot of trade was happening at the time between Western powers and China. So the Philippines provided a great opportunity to sort of access those markets in China. Another factor, and you read about this when you read primary sources from William McKinley, is global competition. And this is competition with other colonial powers, the British, the French, the Germans. McKinley, when this was all sort of happening, McKinley pondered whether or not to go to war in the Philippines, and he said to himself effectively that he felt the Filipino people were unfit, quote in his words, unfit for civilization. He believed it was impossible to imagine giving them back to the Spanish, and he rationalized that if the United States did nothing, that maybe the Germans might come in and make them their colony. So from McKinley's perspective, the Philippines had to be made a colony, if for no other reason than to maintain American competition and influence in the world by keeping the Germans or the Spanish out. And of course, because of the role of racism in history, the idea of allowing the Filipinos to govern themselves was really unthinkable to William McKinley at the time. Pictured here is Queen Lil. Queen Liliuokalani, who was overthrown in 1893 by a revolt led by American sugar farmers. And again, this is the annexation of Hawaii, which occurs in 1898, is completely unrelated really to the Spanish-American War. But it's very much related to the United States' desires to become a significant global power. So the factors in what happens in the Philippines, why did this revolt start in the Philippines, first of all? First of all, you had a lot of American sugar farmers who had gone to the Philippines, or Hawaii, I'm sorry. A lot of American sugar farmers had gone to Hawaii. Well, at this time, Hawaii is an independent territory, and the United States has high tariffs. Kind of covered that when you think about the Gilded Age. They have very high tariffs. Well, if there's a high tariff, then any sugar you sell to the United States, you're going to be penalized with that tariff, that tax on an imported goods. So American sugar farmers wanted free trade. They wanted a non-tariff trading. And this was one of the motivations and why they revolted. They overthrew the monarch, the last monarch of Hawaii, Queen Liliuokalani. And then they asked the president. At the time, the president was Grover Cleveland, to annex Hawaii. And Grover Cleveland actually refused. But in the context of the Spanish-American War, President William McKinley will annex Hawaii, and Hawaii then becomes a really important naval location for the United States. It was a place to port your ships. It was a place to have coaling stations for your large steam-powered, coal-driven navy. And of course, we know Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, will a half century later, a little bit less than a half century later, become really the symbol of Japanese imperial aggression against the United States at that very location in the attack on December 7th, 1941. So you can see here from this map the location of China. This is Taiwan here. In China right here, and you can see from Hong Kong, this is where the American Navy was. And the American Admiral Dewey was told by then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt, when the actual Secretary of the Navy was away from the office, Dewey was ordered to attack the Spanish fleet in the Philippines. And Dewey does this and destroys the Spanish fleet in the Philippines. Meanwhile, the United States had really and the Spanish fleet, by the way, was effectively in mothballs. It wasn't really in any way, shape, or form capable to really resist the Americans. And with the help of Filipino nationalist figures like Emilio Aguinaldo, who sought independence for the Philippines, the Spanish are defeated there, and Manila actually surrenders in August of 1898. However, this is really just the beginning of the Philippine-American War, because, of course, we know that Emilio Aguinaldo, who I'll discuss on the next slide, Emilio Aguinaldo was a nationalist, and he very much thought the United States would grant the Filipino people independence and self-government. And that's why he initially fought with the United States. Ultimately, though, unfortunately for Aguinaldo, he learns that the United States' intentions were otherwise. The United States' drive to colonize the Philippines is really driven in part by a number of factors. One, economic imperialism, i.e., not necessarily for any economic benefit from the Philippine Islands, but rather the ability to access the imperialized territory of China for the lucrative market that was there. John Hay, again, the Secretary of State, the open door to China. This is a big motivation for establishing a colony in the Philippines. Other reasons, as I've mentioned, strategic defense and imperial competition. The Philippines is a place where you can station your soldiers, you can base your troops, you can defend your rights to access and trade in the region, and you can keep European colonial imperial competitors out of the Philippines and prevent them from, again, threatening your right to access the burgeoning market in China. Another factor justifying this in the Philippine-American War is the issue of race and the so-called civilizing mission. Of course, many of us probably know that colonialism across Africa and in Asia during the 1800s and the early 20th century was justified by a racist philosophy, sometimes called the white man's burden. But it was a civilizing mission, and the idea was that somehow white Westerners were the highest level of civilization, and the non-white people in the developing world couldn't possibly govern themselves, was the idea, and therefore it justified what pseudoscientists at the time and imperialists said was the highest race. It justified them going and colonizing them and somehow bringing them to higher civilization. In reality, it's just a racist justification for conquest, destruction, and a manipulation of economics and political affairs within those places. You see here Emilio Aguinaldo, which is pictured in the top, and down here you see an image from fighting in the Philippines near Manila. Aguinaldo was a Filipino nationalist. He was fighting for independence for the Philippines. He was fighting for the right of the Philippines to govern themselves. in his eyes, he saw the United States as an entity that would help him, because the United States is inherently an anti-colonial power. It's the most notable anti-colonial revolution was the American Revolution. But of course, for the reasons that I've mentioned already, the United States, in a brutal war, would take the Philippines as a colony. Filipino deaths in this war were upwards of some 60,000, with a great many of them being civilian deaths. American deaths are around about 6,000. Some scholars, like Stuart Creighton Miller, who's the author of a book, Benevolent Assimilation, which I have on my bookshelf, and I recommend as reading to anyone who's interested in this subject, a subject that doesn't get talked about very often. Really, he emphasizes this point, that this was kind of like America's first Vietnam, meaning it was the first case of a sort of overt imperial war in intense jungled regions of the developing world that resulted in tremendous deaths amongst elements of the population and not just combatants in a really brutal guerrilla war. And so some scholars have viewed this as like America's first Vietnam, and a war in which it really demonstrated the difficulties of fighting irregular, sort of unconventional military forces in sometimes very difficult geographic and environmental regions in and around population centers. This map, we can see the sort of expansion of the United States' influence in the world. Of course, annexed the Hawaiian Islands in 1898, the islands in the Marshall Islands, out here the Philippine Islands, of course, a colony in 1898. Now, Cuba doesn't become a colony, and largely because it doesn't become a colony, that was largely because European powers saw this going on, and they looked at the United States and Cuba and said, aha, you see, you're no different. You're going to become a colonial power too. And because of this, the United States didn't formally make Cuba a territory, but instead basically reserved the right to land troops militarily in Cuba whenever they saw fit, gave them the exclusive right to lease bases in Cuba. Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, remains in American possession well into the 21st century. And the United States effectively rewrote the Cuban Constitution, more or less making Cuba sort of an indirect, almost an indirect possession of the United States for the next half century or so. Puerto Rico, of course, is made a territory. It remains a territory of the United States in the 21st century. And all of these areas that are shaded here are places where the United States sent the Marines, sent the Navy to maintain order, but ultimately to shape the governments of those countries and ensure that those countries had governments in power that made laws and acted in the interest of the United States. In Nicaragua, right here, my book is written about Nicaragua in the 1970s and 80s. But long before that, the United States had Marines sent to Nicaragua between 1909 and 1912. The United States had Marines sent to Nicaragua in 1926, 27 until 1933, and very much shaped its government and its economics in Nicaragua. So you see here a really significant expansion of the United States across the Pacific, again, seeking the access of those Asia markets, but also in Latin America, which the United States treated as like its own backyard. It might not surprise some of you, but the Spanish and Philippine-American War was really controversial. And so controversial that some of the most prominent Americans from the period of the Gilded Age, the period of the late 19th century, actually openly and vehemently opposed these wars. Andrew Carnegie, the famous founder of U.S. Steel, opposed these conflicts. Mark Twain, who of course authored or came up with the term the Gilded Age for that period of the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, opposed these conflicts. Pictured here is the Speaker of the House Thomas Reed, who is sometimes called Thomas Czar Reed, he actually resigned his seat in the House of Representatives as well as his speakership. He left the body entirely out of opposition to the Spanish and Philippine-American War. Reed, Speaker of the House, a very, very important position. The House Speaker basically represents the majority in the House of Representatives and very much shapes the agenda in the House of Representatives, and is actually the Speaker of the House is actually in the succession line to the presidency should the president and vice president be incapacitated or, heaven forbid, assassinated. The Speaker of the House is third in line, followed by the Secretary of State after them. The Anti-Imperialist League really sort of would have based a lot of their thinking as to why they oppose these wars really around American ideology. And I think the core ideas, and you could probably draw out more core ideas, but core ideas, ideology refers to the ideas that are at the heart of a nation, right? Or a movement. And for the United States, those core ideas, many would argue are that the United States is an anti-imperial revolutionary nation, that it was born out of a resistance to a colonial power controlling it, that it's a country that's supposed to represent human rights, that it's supposed to promote democracy, the right of people to sort of determine their own leaders and their own government, the rights of people to have their liberties protected, that people possess certain rights as individuals to be free from inhumane treatment, to be free to pursue their own success within the boundaries of law, individual liberty, the right to fair trial by a jury of your peers. These are all things that are at the core of American ideology, as well as, a capitalist ideology, the idea in the United States that Americans should have, the right to pursue the American dream through forming businesses and engaging in small level capitalist economics. In the Philippines, and this is one of the reasons why groups like the Anti-Imperialist League would have opposed this war, was the Philippines turned into a very, very, very brutal war. And torture was actually commonplace during the Philippine-American War. This is an actual picture of Americans torturing a Filipino using the so-called water cure. And this is a form of torture that could be very, very painful and even fatal, as water would be filled, this person's stomach would be forcibly filled with water. They might stomp on the person's stomach after it was filled with water to force them to vomit in an excruciating way. And this was sort of public knowledge during this war. I mean, you see this Life magazine cover, and here you see American soldiers giving the waterboard to a Filipino, and in the background, the artist has depicted all of the European colonial powers standing around sort of laughing and saying, see, now you're no better than us, effectively. So torture was commonplace in the Philippine-American War. There were a lot of civilian deaths in this war, and this led people to wonder, contemplate, was this consistent with American values? Later in the 20th century, the United States really resoundingly asserted that it was not consistent with American values. In 1984, during the Reagan administration, the United States signed the UN Convention for Human Rights, which barred the use of torture. U.S. leaders like Theodore Roosevelt at the time, too, were appalled by the fact that they saw this happening. Roosevelt himself a proponent of those conflicts, did not believe that the United States should be torturing people in this way. Even at home in the United States police forces used the water cure and other forms of physical violence to force confessions out of prisoners. In fact, getting the third degree which might be something that you've heard before, like giving someone the third degree, actually referred to basically being beat up by the police to try to force a confession out of you. This all changed, of course, with the Miranda rights. Miranda versus Arizona in 1966 was a Supreme Court case that, of course, said that if a person's being arrested, they have to have their rights read to them, that you can't beat them up. You must let them know of their rights, their right to attorney, these types of things. And so we see this happening in the Philippines, but over the course of the 20th century, we see an increasing process in the United States to really condemn inhumane treatment, whether it's in American policing and prisons at home in the United States or whether it is in warfare abroad. The United States in the 20th century resoundingly asserted that it doesn't torture and that it doesn't assassinate. Now, in the 21st century, in the context of the 21st century war on terrorism, we've seen some of those things become challenged, as we know that uses of torture were used during the war on terrorism, and we know that efforts to assassinate political figures were also pursued. And this was all justified in the context of the modern war on terrorism, but really flew counter to some of the most important assertions about the role of the United States when it comes to humane treatment of both people at home that are prisoners